Hi everyone, welcome to lesson 3.6 on the cell cycle. Please make sure to fill in your notes and keep up with your vocabulary as we go through this. So we've seen the characteristics of living things a few times now throughout Unit 3, but today we're going to focus on these three main ideas. Living things reproduce, they grow and develop, and they also maintain homeostasis. So we've heard this term homeostasis a few times now, but remember, cells are the basic living units of all organisms, and sometimes a single cell is the organism, and we call those unicellular. But all living things must maintain homeostasis. To do that, unicellular organisms grow, respond to the environment, transform energy, and reproduce. Remember, unicellular can be both prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Unlike most unicellular organisms, the cells of humans, animals, and other multicellular organisms instead do not live on their own, and they are what we call interdependent. The cells of multicellular organisms become specialized for particular tasks and communicate with one another to maintain homeostasis. So, for cells and levels of organization, two vocabulary terms from this. We have specialized cell and a stem cell. A specialized cell is a cell that has undergone differentiation and is specialized to perform certain tasks. A stem cell is unspecialized and it can give rise to one or more types of specialized cells. Stem cells are also sometimes called undifferentiated or unspecialized, and it's because they sit at the base of branching stem of development from which different cells types form. We classify stem cells broadly into two categories, either adult or embryonic. Adult stem cells are cells in some tissues like blood and skin, and they have a limited lifespan and must be constantly replaced. But there are pools of adult stem cells found in various locations throughout the body, and they can produce the new cells needed for these tissues. There are also embryonic stem cells, and those are referred to as pluripotent cells because they can develop into any of the body cell types. The specialized cells of multicellular organisms are organized into tissues, then into organs, and finally into organ systems. So here is kind of our levels of organization for cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems. So why do cells have to divide and produce more themselves? So there are two main reasons. The larger the cell becomes, the more demands the cell places on its DNA. In addition, a larger cell is less efficient at moving nutrients and waste materials across the membrane. As the cell grows, DNA is used to build the molecules needed for growth. But as a cell increases in size, its DNA does not. So if it continues to increase in the size of DNA, that would no longer be able to serve the needs of the growing cell. In addition to that, food, oxygen, and water enter through a cell membrane, and waste products leave through the cell membrane. And the exchange of molecules depends on the surface area of the cell. So take a moment and kind of examine this ratio of surface area to volume in cells. So looking at this image, this is referring to if the cell was shaped like a cube. So as the length of the side increases, the volume increases more than the surface area. And for a growing cell, a decrease in the amount of cell membrane available creates problems. Again, because of that exchange of molecules, food, oxygen, and water, okay, it has to have a certain surface area to volume ratio. So before we get into the specifics of the cell cycle, we have to talk about cell division and reproduction. Don't get too caught up in all of this information. This is just kind of like a background and reminding you of a couple terms. So before the cell becomes too large, a growing cell divides, forming two what we call daughter cells. The offspring cells resulting from cell division are called daughter cells just due to the fact that once a mother cell divides into two new cells, those offspring will also be able to divide in the future. So in other words, the daughter cells will one day act as mother cells themselves. Cell division is the process by which a cell divides into two new daughter cells. Before a cell divides, the cell copies all of its DNA, and cell division also solves the problem of increasing that size by reducing volume. So, reproduction, the formation of new individuals, is one of the characteristics of living things. And here are two types of reproduction. We have asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is the process of reproduction involving a single parent that results in the offspring that are genetically identical. And if you remember, bacteria use this method of reproduction. Sexual reproduction is a type of reproduction in which cells from two parents unite to form the first cell of a new organism. An offspring produced by sexual reproduction inherits some of their genetic information from both, and most animals and plants reproduce sexually. So for today, we're going to look at mostly asexual reproduction, and mitosis can be a form of asexual reproduction, but meiosis is an early step in sexual reproduction. So again, we're going to get to this a little bit later in Unit 3, but just a reminder on what asexual and sexual reproduction, the difference between the two. So that brings us to the cell cycle. And the cell cycle is a series of events in which a cell grows, prepares for division, and divides to form two daughter cells. The prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell cycles are slightly different. This diagram to the right, the one that you're going to be very familiar with by the end of this unit, this is on eukaryotic cell cycle. And whenever we talk about the cell cycle, that's usually the one that we're referring to as the eukaryotic cell cycle. So here is a diagram and information on the prokaryotic cell cycle. The process of cell division in prokaryotes is a form of asexual reproduction. And if you remember that term, that was called binary fission. So we heard that a few lessons back. So here's kind of a good diagram of what exactly happens. Not a ton is known about the prokaryotic cell cycle compared to the eukaryotic cell cycle, but here's kind of the basics. So once the chromosome has been duplicated, the two DNA molecules attach to different regions of the cell membrane. A network of fibers form between them, stretching from one side of the cell to the other. The fibers constrict and the cell is pinched inward, dividing the cytoplasm and the chromosomes between two newly formed cells. And then remember that binary fission results in the production of two genetically identical daughter cells down here. So the main focus of today's lesson for the cell cycle is the eukaryotic cell cycle. Again, whenever you see cell cycle, this is the one that you should think of, okay? So there are two main phases: interphase, which is the phases of growth and DNA replication, and within interphase we have three phases, and the M phase, or mitotic phase, and that's the division phases. So again, looking at this diagram, G1, S, and G2, all of those are labeled as interphase. If you kind of look at this circle in here, and then the M phase is mitosis and cytokinesis, both of these two together. So interphase is the period of the cell cycle between cell division, and it consists of three parts. So you should know what goes on in each of these three parts. Interphase is the longest stage of the cell cycle. The G1 phase is where cells do most of their growing during this phase. Cells increase in size and synthesize new proteins and organelles. The S phase is also known as DNA replication, and we're going to cover that in a lot of detail next lesson. But new DNA is synthesized when the chromosomes are replicated, and at the end of this stage, the cell contains twice as much DNA as it did in the beginning. The last part of interphase is the G2 phase, also known as the second cell growth phase. Once DNA replication is completed, the cell enters the G2 phase, and many of the organelles and molecules required for cell division are produced. So again, all of these three stages together, G1, S, and G2, is known as interphase. Now the M phase consists of two parts, mitosis and cytokinesis. Mitosis is the division of the cell nucleus, and there are four stages within that: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, and cytokinesis is the division of the cytoplasm. Now we're going to get into the M phase in more detail in a couple lessons, but for now, you should know that the M phase consists of two parts, mitosis and cytokinesis. So how do cells know when it's time to divide? Well, we have a few natural controls that exist on cell growth. So the first way is most cells will divide until they come into contact with each other, and once they come into contact with each other, they are basically stop dividing. So that's what we call contact inhibition, and this right here is a pretty good diagram here to the right of contact inhibition. Another way is that we have something called cyclins, and cyclins are a family of proteins that regulate the cell cycle in eukaryotic cells. So the cell cycle is controlled both by regulatory proteins inside and outside the cell. So you can kind of think of these two internal, external regulators as like cyclins, right? Because they are regulating the cell cycle. So internal regulators respond to events occurring inside of the cell, and external regulators respond to events outside of the cell. And within external regulators, we have another thing that we call growth factors, and those are a group of external regulatory proteins that stimulate the growth and division of cells. So what's another natural control? Well, we also have this thing called apoptosis, and that's what we call programmed cell death. So cells can end their life cycle by accident or injury, or they are literally programmed. And when apoptosis doesn't occur as it should, a number of diseases can result. So as long as this is regulated, then apoptosis is actually a good thing, and it is definitely required to maintain healthy cells. So lastly, we're going to talk about cancer really quickly, and cancer is just uncontrolled cell growth. Cancer cells do not respond to the signals that regulate the growth of most cells, and as a result, the cell cycle is disrupted and cells can grow and divide uncontrollably. Cancer cells can also form a mast of cells called a tumor, which you can see here. So what causes cancer? Well, there are quite a few things, and it can be caused by defects in the genes that regulate cell growth and visions. Now, a couple examples of defects: smoking, tobacco products, radiation exposure, other defective genes, and even viral infection. An astonishing number of cancer cells have a defect in gene called P53, which normally halts the cell cycle until all chromosomes have been properly replicated. So, we're going to cover cancer more in depth later, but for now, this is just kind of your brief introduction to the subject. But again, cancer is just uncontrolled cell growth, and this is a huge reason why the cell cycle and the cell cycle regulators are very important. So we have reached your exit ticket. Go ahead, pause here, and try these on your own. All right, let's go ahead and check yourself. So remember, what is a stem cell? What are the two categories? Stem cells were unspecialized cells that can give rise to one or more types of specialized cells. And the two categories we divided those into were adult and embryonic stem cells. The process of cell division in prokaryotes is a form of asexual reproduction known as binary fission. The two main phases of the eukaryotic cell cycle were interphase and the M phase. And number 4, what occurs during interphase. So remember, that was the period of cell cycle between cell division, and it consists of the G1, S, and G2 phases. It was the time of growth, and the DNA replicates during the S phase. Number 5, the M phase consisted of mitosis and cytokinesis, and that was the actual cell division. And number 6, the two controls of the cell cycle. We had contact inhibition and cyclin proteins, and those included both internal and external regulators. So that is the end of lesson 3.6. Thank you very much for watching, and feel free to reach out with any questions.